George Mallory Hendee was born October 2nd, 1866 in Watertown, Massachusetts, and would get into bicycle racing, high wheeler bicycle racing. He would win the United States National Amateur High Wheeler Competition in 1882. He would also set a record going a half mile around a dirt track in 2 minutes, 27.4 seconds, a record which stood until 1886. Georgie was America's first national cycling champion, winning 302 of the 309 races he would enter. He would even win the world championship. Georgie would retire from bicycle racing in 1897, but remained involved in the cycle community even after retiring from bicycle racing. Sponsoring bicycle racers, Hendee would get into manufacturing his own bicycles at Hendee and Nelson Manufacturing Company, 478 Main Street, Springfield, Massachusetts, building safety bikes using the name Silver King for the male bikes, Silver Queen for the women bikes. The company would inevitably go bankrupt. Hendee would buy all of the unsold stock at auction to sell later on. Also used across the pond, the name was, over in England, the Silver Queen Cycle Company. In 1900, George Hendee would meet Carl Oscar Hedstrom after seeing the Hedstrom Pacer at a race at Madison Square Garden, which was a very primitive version of a motorbike that seated two in tandem, built by Oscar and his partner, Charles Henshaw. It was powered by a modified Dion engine. George Hendee was so impressed by what he saw with the Hedstrom Pacer that he offered Oscar a partnership on the spot to make motorbikes. Oscar built a reputation for himself as a custom builder of racing bikes. It's also important to note that they were experimenting with electric and gas-powered engines. I needed to throw that in there because everybody thinks the e-bikes that are coming out now are brand new. Nothing is new. George and Oscar would partner and established a new company, Hendee Manufacturing Company, in 1897. They would open their first factory in Springfield, Massachusetts. The mission was to produce motorized bicycles for the masses. Hedstrom would build a prototype. Hendee would be the president and general manager of Hendee Manufacturing, while Hedstrom would be the head engineer and designer, as well as supervisor of motorbike production. Hendee would travel extensively trying to set up dealership network and arrange financing for the company. Remember a little while back, all those unsold bikes Hendee bought at auction? He would bring those out and sell them under a different name, under American Indian. The reason Indian was chosen was to differentiate from the kings and queens of England with the American Indian. And then it was just shortened to Indian. After signing the partnership agreement in January of 1901, Hedstrom began working on the very first prototype of the Indian motorcycle. The prototype was built at Worcester Cycle in Middletown, Connecticut. The Indian was tested publicly on Cross Street in Springfield, Massachusetts on Saturday, June 1st at noon. To better refine his engine design, Hedstrom would go to Aurora, Illinois Automatic Machine Company, which were an engine manufacturing company which was contracted to build engines for the Indian cycle. Aurora would supply the engines until the contract was terminated in 1907. Aurora produced engines under license for Indian from 1901 through 1907. It's worth mentioning they were also allowed to sell the Indian engine to other manufacturers and pay Indian a royalty. In 1907, Aurora began making their own motorcycles called Thor, and Indian began making their own engines in-house at that point. The first motorcycle was powered by a single cylinder that produced 1.75 horsepower. In 1901, they would end up building 3 motorcycles, 1 prototype, 2 production units, but it wouldn't be until 1902 that they would sell their very first motorcycle to the public. In 1903, Oscar Hedstrom would set a world speed record on a motorcycle of 56 miles per hour. Up until this point, Indian was painted every color but the iconic red. The iconic red would come in 1904. All Indian motorcycles were single cylinders up until 1904 when Hendee would introduce its very first V-twin. Hedstrom's very first prototype V-twin would make its first appearance in 1904 at Newport Beach, Rhode Island. Rated at 3 horsepower, the production V-twin would show up in 1906 and made 4 horsepower, called the Indian Double Cylinder Racer. Weighed in at 108 pounds and came with a $350 price tag, which would be equivalent to you spending $12,213.17 in the year 2024. The new V-twin design was patterned after the factory racer, but it did not have the twist grips or fenders. Gas tank was torpedo in design, and it straddled the horizontal bar of the frame, not like the Camelback on the other model. Some interesting trivia. The first company to produce a V-twin was made by Glenn Curtis under Hercules. He showed up to the first hill climb, held by the Motorcycle Club of New York, and won, blowing the competition away with his new V-twin. He would go on to make a land speed record in Yonkers, New York. By 1904, Curtis was selling street versions under the name Hercules. So in the USA, Hercules was the first motorcycle on sale with a V-twin. It's important to point out that there were other companies to offer V-twins on motorcycles by 1906. American Motorcycle Company had a 1000cc V-twin on offer, producing 4 horsepower. For those of you wondering, Harley-Davidson didn't come out with a V-twin until 1907. The V-twin showed up even earlier in Europe in 1902. It was fitted to a Griffin with a modified Dion engine. By 1906, 15 different companies would offer V-twin engines in Europe. We have to talk about American hero to some, folk legend to others. Either way, he was a character. He was literally a vaudeville performer. Irwin Baker, more commonly referred to as his stage name, Cannonball Baker. This guy had a knack for driving from New York to LA, and he liked to see how fast he could do it. In 1914, he rode his Indian from San Diego to New York in a record of 11 days, 12 hours, 10 minutes. I wonder how much of that time he spent sleeping, because there's no way that anybody could stay up close to half a month, just 3 days shy of half a month without sleep. But it all started back in 1908 when Irwin would buy his very first Indian and would race it, local races, winning loads of them. His most famous victory was in 1909 when he came in first place at the very first race ever held at the brand new Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Irwin would set 143 driving records. The first one he ever set was on a coast-to-coast run on his 1914 Indian motorcycle. 1916 saw the release of an all-new V-twin called the Power Plus, 42-degree angle, 61 cubic inch displacement, or 1000 cc's. It was able to propel the 1916 Indian up to speeds of 60 miles per hour. The Power Plus could be had on a roadster type and the basis for racing bikes. Hendee offered the Power Plus from 1916 through 1924 with very little changes throughout the years. Oscar Hedstrom would leave the company after a disagreement regarding stock price manipulation on March 24th of 1913. George Hendee wasn't far behind him. He would resign in 1915, staying on as president, but would retire in 1916 at the age of 49. Hendee retired from Hendee Manufacturing after a disagreement with a board of directors over the direction of the organization. Hendee would get into cattle ranching, and he would do that until he would die in 1943 at the age of 76. In 1916, Hendee also released a lightweight model. It was introduced as the Model K. It was powered by a single-cylinder, two-stroke motor. The Model K was only produced for 1 year, being replaced by the Model O, which had a four-stroke flat V-twin. The Model O was produced until 1919. In 1920, Hendee would release an absolute legend, the Scout, which is arguably the most important Indian ever, produced from 1919 to 1949, with V-twin engine sizes ranging from 500, 600, and 745 cc's. The early Scouts from 1920 through 1927 were designed by Charles B. Franklin. In 1923, Hendee would change their name to Indian Motocycle without the R in between O and C. The Scout 101 would follow in 1928 through 1931, designed by Charles B. Franklin as well. The Scout 101 has been called the best bike ever. Many believe this was the pinnacle of Indian. Standard Scout would come out in 1932 and was produced until 1937. 3050 Scout was produced from 1932 through 1941, Sport Scout 1934 through 1942, and then they produced the military Scouts, but they didn't make, or I should say there were very, very limited production Scouts made after the war. They did make a few, but they're very, 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 very rare. Hendee would introduce the Chief in 1922. It would be produced from 1932 through 1942, 46 through 48, and then 50 through 53. They would come back in 1999 through 2003, and then 2006 to present. They are still building the Indian Chief. The Chief was the big V-twin, the larger, more powerful bike. The original intent was for the Chief to replace the Power Plus, but Hendee would keep the Power Plus around as standard model until 1923. This bike was also designed by Charles B. Franklin. In 1927, Indian would buy the rights production facilities of Ace Motor Corporation. Production was moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, where they would produce the Indian Ace for 1 year only, 1927. In 1928, the Indian Ace was replaced by the Indian 401. Indian needed the Ace chassis for their new bike, which was the Indian 4, introduced in 1928. The Indian 401, which was powered by an inline four-cylinder engine, which Indian would offer from 1922 through 1942. They would improve the 4 over its lifespan. During the worst time to sell a luxury motorcycle, they even made a version from 1936 through 1937 with an upside-down engine. In 1940, the 4 frame was modified to include a plunger rear suspension. The Indian 4 was discontinued in 1942, right before World War II. In 1930, E. Paul DuPont sold all of his shares in DuPont Automobile and bought Indiana shares. E. Paul took over the company, forcing out previous management team, putting Loring Joe Hoisley at the helm of the day-to-day decisions. In 1945, a group headed by Ralph B. Rogers purchased a controlling stake in the company. DuPont turned over the company to Rogers, who made costly missteps which led to Indian's demise. When Indian picked up after the war, they only offered one model, the Chief, for 46 and 47. In 1949, they decided to pull Chief off the menu and offered 2 light motorcycles instead. The single, the Arrow, which was the V-twin, and the Scout, which they would eventually discontinue the Scout in 1949 to bring back the Chief. Indian would release an all-new Warrior model in 1950 with a 500cc V-twin. Rogers would step down as CEO and go to Texas Instruments, you know, the company that makes all the calculators in schools. And a new CEO was handpicked, John Brockhouse of Brockhouse Engineering. What was supposed to be a second win turned out to be the final nail in the coffin, so to speak. Production ended up winding down. Some 53s were built with leftover parts. As Rogers liquidated assets, Brockhouse would own the rights, but 1953 was more or less the end of the original Hendee Indian Company. Floyd Claimer would supposedly be given the rights, but as they say, that's another Motorcycle Monday episode for another Motorcycle Monday day. All right, now it's time for Would You Rather. These are not fair, but which one would you rather have? 1920 Indian Scout or 1916 Indian Power Plus or 1924 Indian Chief. I'm going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. On to the second scenario. Which Indian 4 is your favorite? 1928 Indian 4 or 1937 Indian 4 or 1940 Indian 4? Once again, going to leave this here for a minute. If you need more time, feel free, pause the video. Also, what is your favorite Indian in the comment section below? Now it's time for Name That Tune. First person to get both the name of the band and the song title correctly in the comment section will have their comment pinned to the top of it. I hope you guys really enjoyed Motorcycle Mondays. In the comment section, put motorcycle companies that you're interested in seeing mini documentaries on this channel and featured on Mondays, which will be Motorcycle Mondays. Until next time, toodaloo!